as you were just hearing, I used to work at the BBC. I did about 30 years there, including 2 stretches in Brussels, working as Europe correspondent for about 6 months at a time. And I've traveled pretty much everywhere in Europe, reporting on politics and economics and business and so on. So let me start by taking you back to Norway, rather improbably, in about 2015. So I just started doing a series of programs for In Business, which is a 30 minutes business program on BBC Radio 4, which has sadly just been axed because of the BBC cuts. But for that program, we went to Norway to do 2 stories. My producer Ruth and I went to do one on the Norwegian tax system and one on its relationship with the EU. I know what you're all thinking. What on earth made you want to do a half-hour documentary on the Norwegian tax system? I can tell you that afterwards if you're interested. It actually won an award, so it was quite good. But the program on Norway and Brexit is the bit we're interested in today. So we traveled all over Norway. We went to the far north, to Trondheim, to speak to the fishing industry. We traveled to farms outside Oslo to talk to farmers, academics, ministers, and so on. And we visited a company which made boilers, domestic boilers, for one reason. It was really quite interesting because, as you probably know, Norway is in the single market, the European Economic Area. It basically has to abide by EU regulations, and it keeps an awful lot of diplomats and experts in Brussels who spend all their time working out what the EU is going to do next so that they don't get blindsided by it. The EU consults them, but they don't have a vote or any influence. I mean, they can't stop anything happening. And so occasionally a bit of legislation sneaks through that kind of really catches them unawares. And we went to see this boiler company because this is what happened to them. The EU had introduced new legislation on domestic boilers, which made them much more environmentally friendly and was heavily written up in favor of French and German boiler manufacturers, as quite often happens with EU legislation. Somebody had a clever idea and thought they could gain a bit of an advantage by creating an EU regulation. And this boiler company just outside Oslo basically had to close down their production line overnight, completely redesign their boilers because they hadn't seen this legislation coming, they hadn't been warned about it, and then redesign their boilers and redesign the production line and then reopen it again. And they survived. I mean, they did all right, but it cost them a small fortune. And we did that to illustrate the fact that although Norway was in the single market, it had no influence really on the EU. It just had to take what it was given. And this is actually, there was a phrase for this when I was at university. It was called government by fax, in that the EU would just fax the latest regulations and rules to the Norwegian government, and the Norwegian government would just introduce them into Norwegian law, and that was it. And so when we went to interview the Europe minister in Oslo, in his office, while we were setting up the interview, I was kind of looking around, and he kind of went, "Well, what are you looking for, Mr. Bloom?" And I said, "I'm looking for this famous fax machine where all the regulations from Brussels arrive, and you just pass them into Norwegian law." And he goes, "Oh," says Mr. Bloom, he says, "that's an old wives' tale." He says, "There's no fax machine at all." He says, "They just email us these days. We're very advanced." And it's true. They would just email them the latest bit of legislation, and Norway would bring it into Norwegian law. And I think there's been 2 times, one thing to do with postal regulation and one to do with subsidies for a Norwegian road tunnel in the far north, which they just ignored. When the EU complained about it, they kind of said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't worry about it." And they got away with it. But I think there's only been 2 instances where they didn't actually follow EU regulations. Anyway, the conclusion of this half-hour documentary, having spoken to all these people, to the Norwegian equivalent of the CBI, to companies and farmers and fishermen and ministers, was that for Norway, it kind of worked. It's a small country. It can't set its own international standards anyway. It has a very large oil and gas sector, which means it's very wealthy. And oil and gas isn't really covered by EU regulations anyway, so it doesn't really make much difference to them. And the other parts of their economy being relatively small and totally dependent on trade with the EU, it just makes sense for them to accept EU regulations. And they also pay into the EU budget for various reasons. I put it to them that was the price they paid for access to the single market, but they denied that blind. They said, oh no, we just like giving money to Poland, you know, it's in our interests. But basically they have to pay something into the EU kitty. But the conclusion of the Norwegian government and the Norwegian CBI and of our report was that although this made sense for Norway, they all said the UK would be mad to do this, because the UK is a much bigger economy and it's much more dependent on trade with the EU. And it has whole industries from the city to car manufacturing and agriculture, fishing, everything basically, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, which only really work because we sell across a huge market, being the EU. And the UK needed to have its feet under the table to be making the decisions, to have vetoes to influence the legislation in its own interest, and that it would lose out if it wasn't sitting round the table. The most interesting thing about that was that we came to that conclusion that the UK could be like Norway. It was possible, but it was pretty dumb. And the very next day after it was broadcast, and this is the point of the story, I got a wave of abuse on social media that was like a tsunami. I had hundreds of people coming for me. All of them Brexiteers. And remember, this is before the referendum. All of them Brexiteers, the nicest of which was, why are you a lying bastard, you lying bastard, right? And I have toned that down because it's a Sunday. It was considerably more aggressive and nastier than that. And their argument was, no, we'd be fine as Norway. That's what we want. We want out of the EU. We want to be able to set our own trade deals, but no one's talking about burning bridges or anything like that. It's fine. Why are you lying about this? And yet, less than a year later, after the referendum, the Norway option became treason overnight. It became a betrayal of the vote. It was not real Brexit, it was faux Brexit. We would still remain shackled to a corpse. We wanted to break every possible link. We had obviously voted for a complete and total separation, and we were having nothing to do with those bastards in the EU at all ever again. And we would all be better off as a result. That's what the referendum changed. It wasn't just the Brexiteers won the vote. They won the vote and the ultras took over. In the end, they took over the Conservative Party and won elections, and now they're in control. But when that happened, I really started assuming that we would leave with no deal whatsoever, because I didn't see how you could negotiate from that position. And we came perilously close to leaving with no deal. But it helps explain why things are so bad now and why I think they're going to continue to get worse. Okay? And just to kind of, show we're all on the same side, one of the things that makes me really angry about Brexit is Brexiteers, including I have a friend who's a Brexiteer who just says, why don't you get over it? It's happened, you lost, this is the new reality, get over it. And you kind of go, well, if we'd done what you said you were going to do, i.e. become like Norway, I could have lived with that. It would have been a pretty stupid thing to do. But we didn't do any of those things. We actually burnt all the bridges. It went from the divorce where, a couple agree to, split amicably and still see the children and they'll still be friends, to basically, burning the Porsche and cutting his trousers of his suits up within a day. I mean, that's what basically happened. And so there was no compromise. There was no attempt to bring Remainers on board and say, well, we're still European and we still like the EU and they're our friends. There was none of that. It was just total and utter divorce. And we know what that means because the Treasury's forecasts from before the referendum, which no serious economist I know has really questioned or criticised, meant that if we'd gone for the Norway option, we would have lost between 1% and 2% of British GDP over 10 years. And when growth is normally around 1.8 or 2%, losing 0.1 or 0.2% is probably within the margin of error. It's probably within the calculation margins of error of GDP figures you wouldn't really notice. The deal we got, which was pretty much the best available after Theresa May's red lines were drawn up, which was pretty much the stupidest negotiating mistake I've ever heard of. The Treasury's calculations for that was we'll lose between 6 and 9% of GDP over 10 years. So that is 3 to 4 or 5 times worse than the deal we could have got, which would have been the best one available. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. And that 6 to 9% when you're growing at 1.8% means your growth rate will halve for the next 10 years. That's how big it is. So our growth will halve over the next 10 years because of it. And it's worse than that because the Brexiteers are just refusing to acknowledge that any problems now are anything to do with Brexit. Or if they are, then they're not a problem there for the good. So you had the business secretary on Friday and the Prime Minister today claiming that petrol station chaos was part of the plan. This was all part of a cunning plan to end low pay in this country and force up wages, which kind of assumes that it was the EU that was holding down wages and productivity in this country. This is economic illiteracy. You only have to look at the figures from the G7 or the OECD on productivity and wages and wealth to realize we're bottom of the league table in comparison with most EU countries. So it's not being in the EU that's the problem. It's a particularly British problem. And more than that, this is the Conservative Party that's saying these things. And this is the party that destroyed the trade union movement to keep wages down, opposed the minimum wage, has eviscerated the apprenticeship scheme over the last couple of years through sheer incompetence, and promoted the gig economy. So it's just pure hypocrisy to say this. It's economic illiteracy on a massive scale, because if wages for everybody get forced up, then you end up with an inflationary spiral like the 1970s, where everyone demands more wages to make up for the fact that prices are going up because wages are going up. This would be a disaster if it actually came about, and there is a pretty good chance of it coming about. But because it is happening in part because of Brexit, it must be a good thing. In the same way that John Redwood thinks making food imports and exports more difficult is a good result of Brexit, because all of a sudden he seems to want us to eat homegrown turnips and cut down on food miles. And therefore Brexit is a good thing because it cuts down on food miles. There is never any downside to Brexit. It's all for the good because the cause is pure. You've all come across this, and you will have realized long ago that we're basically talking about a cult here. The Brexiteer ultras are like the Hare Krishnas or the Waco extremists or something. Anything from the real world that questions their beliefs is a lie, or an attempt to corrupt the purity of their cause or their faith, or any consequences, like dressing in orange blankets and begging in the streets, is actually for the best. It's good for you. And then you have to tie that together with the realization that the Conservative Party has been taken over by UKIP and has won the populist vote. It's riding a tiger of anti-immigration. Why have we been left behind? It's all the metropolitan elite's fault. And it has a guarantee of staying in power at least beyond the next election. It's almost impossible to see the Conservatives being beaten at the next election. And therefore you have this kind of messianic belief in the project, coupled with the idea that they're never going to lose, which isn't really very healthy, to put it mildly. And so you have kind of an all-powerful anti-immigration sentiment, whatever the economic damage, which is why the solution to the HGV problem is to bring in 5,000 drivers for 4 months. Well, this is, you don't attract people to solve a problem like that by saying, we told you to go away, we'd like you to come back for 3 months, and then we'd like you to bugger off again. I mean, this isn't going to work. You can wrap yourself in the flag, even though the rest of the world is mocking you. You can try and recreate, sorry, there's a dog fight going on outside. I'm sure they'll sort it out. You can recreate the empire, apparently, but only with white nations. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain are going to form some new kind of superpower, which, the empire is dead and buried 60, 70 years ago. This is ridiculous. You can try and talk up trade deals and rebalance towards the Pacific. Some of us are old enough to remember when I think it was Dennis Healey ended the pretensions of east of Suez defence policy in the UK because we couldn't afford it. We didn't have any bases there. We didn't have any enough resources to defend the North Atlantic, let alone the Pacific. So, and the thing to remember about the trade deals, which is I'm sure you know, the 6 to 9%, excuse me, the 6 to 9% economic damage that the Treasury predicted is all the bad things that Brexit will cause minus all the good things. So those trade deals and any deregulation are already in the calculation. I think it was actually 6.3 to 9.3% economic damage would be caused by Brexit, and there's about 0.3 good things from new trade deals or slightly better trade deals to counterbalance it. So those calculations, it's already in the figures. And so if you look at the Office for Budget Responsibility's website, they have a little footnote on the trade deal with Japan, pointing out that, you know, from the government's own figures, it will improve the economy by, I think it's 0.07% over time. And then it kind of points out that that 0.07 is comparing the Japanese trade deal with no trade deal whatsoever. And as it points out, we did have a trade deal with Japan through the EU. So that 0.07 is a false figure. It is far, far less than that. And yet we have the government using all the power and resources of the government as it would and can do, telling us that this is a triumph. And this can all end very badly. You know, this is overreach. This is trying to punch above our weight, which, you know, we're always told the UK punches above its weight. I don't know much about boxing, but if you punch above your weight, eventually you're going to get a very good beating because the other guy's bigger and stronger. That's how it works. Just look at Afghanistan. We were humiliated in Afghanistan, not by the Taliban, but by Washington. They didn't tell us what was happening. They didn't warn us. They didn't take the Prime Minister's phone calls. They didn't care what the UK thought or did. So, you know, we are in a very dangerous position. We are basically out on a limb, and we're actually soaring through the branch at the same time. How can things get worse from here? Let me just take you through through the issues. The latest Purchasing Managers Index figures came out, I think it was on Friday, and showed a sharp slowdown in confidence. The purchasing managers are the people, as the name suggests, who purchase the raw materials and the components and the goods, excuse me, and the energy for factories and offices and retail outlets and all kinds of things. So it's a lead indicator. If they start buying less, it means the factory is going to produce less. And what really hit that confidence was the supply chain problems, the HGV shortage, all those kind of things. And probably the fact that the government was doing very little about it. And that really hit confidence. So what we're seeing at the moment is a bounce back from COVID, very strong economic growth, but not strong enough that it isn't affected by Brexit and by these shortages and the confidence that's being affected. Excuse me just a second, I'm going to take a drink of water. Then we have worker shortages. We've already talked about HGV drivers and the visas. The City of London is now lobbying very hard to get Brexit, visa exemptions of its own, which is quite weird because the minimum wage you have to earn, I think, to be allowed to come in as a skilled worker to the UK under the Home Office's new ridiculous immigration system is £30,000, and most people in the city earn a lot more than £30,000. But the city is pointing out there's an awful lot of red tape. They have to justify every case. They have to make applications. They have to pay into the health service or get health insurance for these people. And there's no provision for temporary visas. So people can come over for 2 or 3 months to work in the head office and then go back. So even the city, which is the wealthiest part of the country, is now lobbying for more immigration or more visas. Retail will be hit. Abattoirs will be hit because, and food processing industry, very dependent on immigration. Hospitality, something like 40% of the workers in hospitality are from abroad. It just goes on and on. Some of the really worrying things are care homes. The work is very badly paid. It is difficult. The hours are awful. It wouldn't take much for the care home industry to just collapse because it will run out of workers. Construction is terrifying. I keep hearing reports of construction sites just standing still. And the NHS is very worrying. There's like 15% of staff in the NHS are from abroad. And just from your own experience, you'll know what it would be like if there were 50% fewer consultants or nurses or GPs or whatever. The Prime Minister today said that the government was trying to solve these problems by massive investments in training and education. This is rubbish. One of my pet subjects was the apprenticeship levy, which was introduced about 6 years ago, an attempt to reform the apprenticeship scheme, and has been an utter disaster. It's cost about 400,000 apprenticeship places because it's appallingly badly run. It's very, very complicated, too much red tape. Lots of companies have just given up on apprenticeships as a result. And if you wanted to prepare for this, if this was all a cunning plan to reskill the economy, improve efficiency and productivity and so on, you would have started 5 years ago training nurses and doctors and bricklayers and plumbers and HGV drivers, and nothing was done. Absolutely nothing was done. If you look at the Northern Ireland Protocol, there's a lot of talk about the government introducing Article 16, possibly during the Tory party conference next week. They seem to think they have the right to do this. They also seem to think it means that they can just evoke Article 16, tear up the whole protocol and walk away. And that's not what Article 16 says. It says you can suspend it while you negotiate a better deal that works better. And the government isn't talking about it, it's just talking about tearing it up and demanding that the EU does what it says. The EU will be very nice about it. They will offer talks, they will offer some temporary solutions, but in the end, they will stick to the law, which is what they always do. They will start taking the UK to court, they will start fining the UK. And if they don't get what they want, they can always increase the red tape at the border, impose bigger tests, more checks, slow everything down. And the UK would suffer disaster. It would be pretty much the equivalent of a no deal in the end. And yet today you had the defence minister threatening to send the Royal Navy in to chase French fishing boats out of British waters. You know, this saber rattling is not going to end well, and I find that very frightening. Then you have things like the shortage of veterinary surgeons, as I was saying, and SPS checks. That's checks on food and animals and agricultural products. The SPS, which is sanitary and phytosanitary standards, our standards are exactly the same as the EU because we're in the EU for so long, and there's not really much incentive to change it at all. The reason we have these checks is because the Brexit ultras refused to have us do anything that was connected with the EU. So we have identical standards, which involve checking everything at the border to check that we're still sticking by the same standards. It's absolutely madness. Michel Barnier's got a very funny bit in his book on the negotiations when he explains how they had to tell the ERG group of Brexiteers that you couldn't check on the health of Northern Ireland cows with a drone. You did actually have to send a vet along. And this was the level of the negotiations they were in. They couldn't believe what the British government was proposing or trying to get away with. And in the end, they didn't get away with it. They had to impose the tests. And that's why M&S sandwiches took a whole extra day to get to Paris, and they should have. And in the end, Marks and Spencer's closed its stores in France as a result. And you have border checks. The red tape alone is 7 billion a year forever. And we have not introduced yet all the checks at the border because the government didn't prepare for it, train the people or build the facilities to do it, and it's been delayed for another year. And the really worrying thing about all this is actually inward investment. There are two big economic hits from Brexit. They are basically the shortage of foreign workers, as we've already talked about, and productivity. Productivity in the UK is very low. What keeps it from being even worse is car companies and other manufacturers and companies coming and setting up in the UK because they send their most efficient people and equipment and plants to countries like the UK because this is an expensive place to do business. You don't set up a sweatshop in the UK. You set up a very advanced manufacturing site. And our productivity is going to get worse because inward investment is falling. As a result of Brexit, we've already seen the figures. And if you just think about it, they used to come here to set up a factory because they could sell anywhere in the EU. Now they can sell in the UK and have problems selling in the rest of the EU, so it's much less attractive. So I'll just tell you a quick story. When when we were in the BBC, we used to have this lunchtime meetings off the record with top business people. And they'd come along and have some terrible dried BBC sandwiches, and we tried to get them to talk off the record. Didn't work all the time, but we had a fantastic briefing once from a large car manufacturer. It was off the record, so I can't tell you who it was. But basically, they were talking about Brexit, and they said, we have car plants across Europe and across the world. We're a very large car manufacturer. And we build cars with just-in-time technology. We bring in components from across the continent. They cross borders all the time. And at the moment, we have one person working part-time who deals with red tape to bring those components from anywhere in the EU. After Brexit, we'll need an office of about 10 people to deal with that red tape, but we're a wealthy company, we can afford that. We do just-in-time manufacturing. If there are delays at the borders and things like that, that will cost us money. We will have to spend a lot more time and effort making sure that stuff arrives on time, set out earlier. That will cost us money. We're a wealthy company, we can deal with it. If there is a real threat to just-in-time manufacturing, we're going to have to build a warehouse. That's 50 million for the land, 100 million for the building, 200 million for the computerized stacking collection of parts, and the capital investment in all those spare parts, which we didn't have to spend before. It will cost us a lot of money, but we're a wealthy company, we can afford it. But he said, and this is the key, when a new model of car comes out or production has to be increased, headquarters plays each of the manufacturing plants across Europe and around the world off against each other and says, whoever can make this cheapest gets the job, gets the work. And we're talking about 10 years of production. And he just said, these are all costs that none of the other plants will ever have to find. So it just makes it much more difficult for us to win the next contract, the next model, the next period of production. So the car industry isn't going to die overnight, but it just becomes much more difficult to do anything about it, to actually win those orders, to get that inward investment. And that is devastating for the British economy. I could go on, but the real tragedy is that these are all perfectly solvable. Remember Norway. We could have got a deal, which meant that 99% of these things were not an issue. So I don't think we're going to rejoin the EU in my lifetime. The schism is too deep. They probably wouldn't have us anyway. But there are numerous things you could do to make it easier. So you could have stayed in the chemical industries regulations REACH. The day after the referendum, being an impartial and balanced BBC reporter, I said, I must find a company that actually thinks Brexit's a good idea. And I remember that the chemicals industry, the wonderfully named CIA, the Chemical Industries Association, had been campaigning for years against REACH, which was the EU's register of industrial chemicals, because it had cost billions to test and register and check every chemical that anybody ever used with this computerized database in the EU. And they'd been protesting about it for years. So I phoned them up and I said, well, you must be happy. Now we're out of the EU. We can leave REACH. And they said, are you mad? We love it. It cost a fortune to set up, but it's brilliant. We can sell chemicals anywhere in the world because we meet these standards, because people can just look up this database for free and then order the stuff knowing it's safe and it's been checked and it's been tested. And we want to stay in. Well, we didn't stay in. What we did is we created something called, I call it Breach, which is the British REACH. And we did it by Control-C, Control-V. We just copied all the regulations over to a UK database and made the companies do it again. So twice the red tape. The CE mark, you all know what the CE mark, had something here with it on. Every phone, every bit of equipment you ever buy has got a CE on it. It's there, it's on that bit of kit. That's my login to my nationwide account, and it says CE, which means it complies with European standards. We could have stayed in that. We didn't. We set up a UK E1, which means that every product and every spare part and every component had to be retested again to make sure it met UK standards, even though UK standards are identical to European standards, because we've only just left and nothing has changed. We eventually had to put that back for a year because we don't have anything like enough testing bodies in the UK. It all had to be sent to the EU so that they could test that the thing that they'd already tested for us complied with the rules and regulations that they already knew it complied with because they'd already tested it for the CE mark. It was a complete and utter waste of time and money. It means there's 2 times the red tape. So you could stay in that. You could have complied with SPS standards, as I mentioned before. That would remove 80% of the red tape at the border with Northern Ireland, for instance. The Northern Ireland Project wouldn't be an issue, really, if we were in SPS. And there are numerous other things like that, Erasmus, the European Space Agency, which we could have paid a little bit of money and stayed in. But we couldn't, because it would have meant the EU having some say over those regulations and us paying them money. And of course, that would have meant that ideologically, the Brexiteers couldn't accept it because it wasn't pure, wasn't a complete break. And these things all add to costs. They're all bits of grit being thrown into the machine. So funnily enough, there is one kind of bright spot from the current crisis. The problem with Brexit was for Remainers, not that you would want a car crash, but that Brexit has always been basically a slowly deflating tyre rather than a spectacular crash and burn on the M6. And you could basically solve the problem by just reinflating the tyre occasionally, giving some more money to Nissan and other car makers to stay in this country, weakening the anti-immigration stance from time to time when industries needed it, all those kind of things. But the government seems determined not to do those things. So that, you do have the feel at the moment it's more of a car crash. But is that changing anything? Are the public noticing that things are actually getting worse? Well, the petrol shortage is apparently more people blame the media than blame the government. And this latest line from the business secretary and the prime minister, that this is all part of a cunning plan to increase wages and skills and productivity, really plays to that atavistic anti-immigration groundswell which helped win the referendum vote for them. They played the race card and they won. They basically did what Enoch Powell tried to do in the 60s. At the time, he was kicked out of the Conservative Party for that. Now, basically, he's won. And UKIP have taken over the Conservative Party. And so you will continue to get this government effort to portray everything as either fine, getting better, or part of a cunning plan to shake up the British economy, and it's just what we need. Last week, ahead of this, just because I knew I was going to be talking to you, I consulted a very senior economist. I didn't tell him I was going to use his name, so I won't. But I basically said that HM Treasury calculation that this kind of Brexit would cost between 6 and 9% of economic growth over the next 10 so years. Was it based on a government that was vaguely competent, efficient, sensible, diplomatic, and efficient? And therefore, since we are none of those things at the moment, should we assume that actually it's considerably worse than that? I.e., the model didn't take into account just how stupid the government was going to be. And he said, no, it's not that delicate a model. Basically, it's just based on if you put barriers in the way when none existed, things will get worse. And we can calculate fairly accurately how much worse they'll be without specifying that, there'll be a shortage of petrol here and a shortage of turkeys at Christmas. We just know these kind of things are going to happen. So this is basically what the Treasury was expecting. Not specifically, but this kind of thing. It's going to keep going on like this. The British economy just doesn't have enough workers. Even if we did train all those brickies and doctors and everything, there aren't enough people in this country to replace the people who came over here to work. I don't know, I know this goes up on Twitter. I would advise you that somebody who knows far more about this than I do, used to be an external member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, and there's a very, very highly respected economist called Adam Posen, P-O-S-E-N. And if you go on Twitter, you can see several lectures and talks he's given about Brexit. And the best bit, they are very, very well informed and very clear, as you would expect from a very astute economist like him. And he basically says, this is the equivalent of a trade war. That's how bad it is. It's a trade war. The UK is the only country in history that has actually torn up a trade deal and renegotiated a much worse trade deal. It's the equivalent of starting a trade war on yourself. And actually, that just makes it very clear. What the British government is doing is basically acting as though it's, cutting economic links, putting up barriers to trade, putting up tariffs, putting up all kinds of red tape, which in the past economies did to disadvantage their rivals, but we're doing it to disadvantage ourselves. This is economic suicide, or at least economic self-harm. And there's no one else to blame. It's not the EU that's putting up these barriers, it's us. So this is a self-inflicted trade war. That's about the totality of my comments. I'm sure there are some pretty long faces out there now. I just didn't want to really depress you on such a lovely afternoon. But if you tune into a talk on why things can only get worse, you've only got yourselves to blame. And my final point is, despite all these problems, the government doesn't care. It's going to win the next election. It doesn't really care.